how are you doing? Long time no see.
I know, and I feel like we haven't seen each other in person, but we've talked, so it's good to see you again.
What did he say? A name with a face or a voice with a face?
Something like that. Anyway, I'm so glad that you joined me today. I think we're going to have a fun time just talking about CLM in general.
Yeah.
You and I have known each other for several years, and so I thought, gosh, if I'm talking to CLM practitioners and people with a point of view in the space, you would be somebody that I would love to talk to and have on the show. So thanks for joining.
Thank you, and I've seen what you're doing in the space and glad to be part of the CLMRX podcast.
Yeah, it's fun. I'm excited about it. So let's kick off. I'd love to hear a little bit about just you in general. We can start off with your intro. Matthew, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we can jump into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just give a little background about me. So I've been in the SaaS space for many years. Kind of cut my teeth in that with data privacy many years ago in the Bay Area. And that's where I garnered a keen interest in legal meets technology, because back then data privacy was a little more nascent than it is today. You had EU Safe Harbor, which was replaced by Privacy Shield, now GDPR, which is more holistic, can be more strenuous for an organization to adhere to. And my whole thing back then, I was in sales, not customer success, is I approached data privacy from not just a legal lens, but how is it impactful to organizations? Now we see it every day in the news, but back then my approach was, let me help the legal team work in concert with marketing, work in concert with the product team, work in concert with the sales, because at the end of the day, you want to collect the most amount of data to make it actionable for not only you as an organization, but to make a better product, a better experience, and also, I would say, a more relatable product for the end user. And so from there, kind of my quick customer journey ended up in the CLM space some years ago, where we eventually met in that network, and really saw the connecting point. You know, when I heard about CLM, just like most, had never heard about it. And there was this kind of journey of, you have this holistic platform where legal can meet with their counterparts, negotiate and review a contract, agree on clause, library, and kind of agree on the included language. And I thought that was impactful. It's really the four corners of that paper, everything that's operational and impactful to an organization, and every penny in and out, and every word in and out of an organization. So I think that's my quick journey of just the data privacy background and then into the CLM space. And now I'm in customer success, so I get to work with clients post-go live on their journey in perpetuity.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a little bit about that. So you and I ran into each other along the customer success journey. I took a pit stop in customer success for a couple of years, and you and I met when we were both working for a CLM provider named Icertis. So we go back for quite some time. Starting when Icertis was really just getting its sort of feet wet in the CS space, or customer success space. So I wondered, as a practitioner who's mostly transitioned into customer success, how do you like that role within sort of data privacy or the CLM space? I know I'm probably taking you for a curveball with that question, but I just wondered how, as a practitioner in the CLM space, how do you feel the data privacy and sort of the security of that space is informed by your role as a CSM?
Yeah, I think just going back to, I hearken the days when I was in data privacy specifically, and in security, there was an overlap. And then I was sales and account management. And so even then, you know, going through the sales cycle, you're learning about the pain points, you're learning about their success metrics and KPIs. And so I think I take that with me to this very day as customer success. Although I'm not part of the net new sales necessarily, I'm partnering with sales on account strategy. As we've seen, whether it's in a recessionary climate or not, it's always important to kind of follow the 80-20 rule. You know, generally 80% of your business is from 20% of your customers. And so leaning in that, you know, have a guided strategy together, work with your cross-functional teams. And I think that customer success, what's attracted me to it is, you know, there's definitely hard days, like any role in an organization. But I think truly understanding why they bought it, always validating that pain point along their journey, and then also introducing new things that you can solve for. In this case, CLM, being a CLM practitioner that they didn't even think about. They start with a sales side use case, and then, oh, by the way, your finance team, HR team, and procurement team also can benefit from the world of CLM.
Yeah, I always like to say that the CLM implementation is never done.
Yeah,
There's always someone else in the organization that's interested in it or could benefit from it. So it's sort of an ongoing activity, I think.
Yeah, and I would just say real quickly, Cami, on that, even within a use case too, you might have just kind of a contained group of people, say within a sales team, that are going to use CLM, and even then, you might start in North America, then move to EMEA. So again, even that implementation can continue with a different workflow, different teams, different sub-workflows. So yeah, great point.
So when you're putting your hat on, your early days of cybersecurity, how do you think about that with the data that's available in contracts today? Like, how do you talk about that with your customers, and how is your sort of opinion informed by that background that you bring?
Yeah, so I think, there's kind of two trains of thought. There's data privacy and then security, and then just kind of stopping there and then going into your question about contracts specifically. So data privacy, I heard the analogy once from one of my general counsels that I partnered with as a former sales guy, is he always said, think about data privacy as front of firewall and then security sort of behind the firewall. Again, there's exceptions to that rule. Yeah, I really like that, because you think of data privacy as what you're collecting, and then once it goes behind the firewall, how are you safeguarding it? But in terms of contracts, because the contract governs everything and anything inside of an organizational standpoint, or inside of an organization in terms of the language in there, I think of data privacy, like I mentioned before in my intro, I had experience in EU Safe Harbor. Well, that became Privacy Shield, became GDPR, and then you have cross-border transfer rules. You also have the APEC framework. So I think of it, let's start out with the governing laws. I think that's probably the easiest place to start. If you work with a multinational, you can work with them on a GDPR, and then really understanding what it means to them, because GDPR is going to mean something in contracts different for an HR use case versus, say, a marketing contract. Marketing contract might need to have a little more, well, actually both should have equal scrutiny, but I would say marketing, there's a lot more things at play in terms of what data they might gather, and then what partners they might share in that data from a contractual standpoint. And then
thinking about the HR use case, you've got all of that employee data you've got to protect.
Absolutely, and again, we have different laws, and at least America, a lot of our states have at-will employment. But then, in a climate of EMEA, or specifically UK, I think it's called garden leave, you have to be very careful about how you're dismissing or retiring somebody from an organization. And it all goes back to what's in the contract, correct? So an American HR leader would have to really understand the constructs and the confines of a UK employment contract versus an American contract.
Right, for sure. That's an important distinction. What are some of the other areas that are impacted when you're looking at GDPR, particularly for those use cases? What are some of the other areas where you see data being impacted, specifically to contracts?
Yeah, so I think... Okay, yeah, absolutely. So I think for me, what I liken it to is everyone hears the word data breach. I'll give you a personal example. I have T-Mobile, and unfortunately they've been a victim, or they've suffered, I think, 2 different breaches in the last 12 months or so. And so, even from a B2C standpoint, what does that mean? What are they in the hook for in terms of potential fines or anything that they might need to recover, or me as a victim potentially? But I think from a data breach, from an overall perspective, if maybe I can give the example of Target. I don't know if you remember this example, Cami, about 10 years ago, where a Target was impacted at point of sale, and it was really through a third-party HVAC vendor. Perfect example of you have that kind of -1, -2, or maybe +1, +2, depending on what you're talking about, in your partner's supply chain. And so who's actually on the hook for that data breach? In the case of Target, I can't remember the exact outcome. I think Target had the punitive measure, but could actually point to that HVAC vendor saying, no, we have the overall agreement between us and that third party, and then here's what's in that contractual language. And in this instance, because with access to HVAC, could they be on the hook for it potentially, any punitive measure? Or maybe it's they share the fine. That's just an example of a data breach, and where you bring in third parties, which is common in most organizations, small to large, where they could be on the hook for that, and then that's the liability aspect and obligations.
Yeah, for sure. Scary stuff, right? And I feel like in this space, I often hear the words, it's not if, it's when.
Yep.
And so it's when your organization might be impacted by a security breach like that, and what are you going to do about it to keep yourself as safe as possible, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in terms of contracts and CLM, again, there's a wide variety of CLMs, but most of them, offer similar functionality in terms of contract workflow and analytics. And so what kind of talk there is, in terms of data breach or what you're liable for, let's just talk about GDPR, is making sure that you have obligation tracking in terms of GDPR. So maybe if I'm McDonald's, again, I'm speaking at a high level, you're pushing out a new marketing campaign that's going to target EU citizens, and then you're partnering maybe with the latest, greatest marketing tech stack. And so that's something where, from obligations, maybe bringing in your marketing team into a contractual workflow. Maybe it's owned by a general counsel or the legal team, but they're going to partner with that particular marketing team, maybe even the product team. And when those obligations come about, they can be easily read and understood by the various characters, legal and then their business partners. And then making sure, is there any upcoming additional obligations? For instance, maybe they need to audit themselves on a quarterly basis, yearly basis, to make sure those specific things are intact from a marketing standpoint.
Yeah, I like to tell the story early in my CLM days when I failed an audit because I couldn't put my finger on all the contract documents that we had. So kind of switching gears with that as an example, how are you educating your customers on the front end of the process to ensure that they're as safe as they can be when that data breach happens?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's proactive measures maybe around the implementation or just slightly after the implementation?
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, so I think one thing I love about CLM is it can be a source of truth. I don't think we talked about that at all. Some people would say it's CRM or ERP, but maybe for a GDPR specific use case, it can be a source of truth. So, if you have an MSA or some kind of agreement, let's just give the marketing example, you also probably have to have a lot of different supporting documents. And so why would you have those in disparate repositories? Especially in the case of GDPR, you're also working with the data protection authorities, or you might be working with a regulator if you're a big enough organization with pretty regular cadence. And so if the regulator comes and taps you on the shoulder, I always advise that, can you have all those supporting documents? Again, maybe it is that third party technology company that you're working with to push out that marketing campaign to European families if you're McDonald's, and you can easily show kind of the audit trail. So even if you were negotiating that contract and they want to see how it was negotiated, that's easily shown as well, versus even 5 years ago, I would argue most organizations, small to large, they'd have a tough time to show not only what they were doing in terms of contractual language, and they have everything set in stone. They might be able to, it might take weeks, months to find those supporting documents. And then even from a third party perspective to show that, okay, maybe the third party is jointly responsible depending on what kind of data is collected and where and how it's deployed on their websites and mobile apps.
Yeah, that's something that's I haven't considered, but that is something that across the liability for a data breach like that, you'd have to sort of share the onus and responsibility, right? Who had the data, who owns it. Kind of unpacking something you said earlier that I wanted to dig into a little bit. When I talk to customers about repository and starting there, it's usually like step one, phase zero, if you will, because getting your documents into a single source of truth, back to that source of truth terminology, so that you can track the things that you're talking about. I hadn't ever considered using, regulatory reasons. I often talk about obligation management, but I hadn't thought about it from like a GDPR angle. How are you talking to your customers about, documents being all over the place when you're thinking about security or data privacy?
I just try to understand where they're at today. In my days of actually when I worked for a data privacy company, is not uncommon where they'd be in, well, actually back then, probably a little more printed and drawers, stuffed away in drawers, in maybe a SharePoint, maybe even a thumb drive. I'm dating myself a little bit, but really to understand the holistic view. And so, back then I would say the primary driver business partner was general counsel and the legal team. But then over time, I think that you really brought in, again, those cross-functional departments and teams, and understanding, can we have a holistic view? Because yes, the legal team might own that responsibility of GDPR, or maybe they've been appointed that, but if the marketing team is pushing out these marketing campaigns, they need to work in concert with their legal counterparts and then have a holistic view to it. So, you talk about the single source of truth, a repository, making sure that whatever structure it is, if you actually have like a hierarchical visual tree of contracts, or just the naming convention, I would actually advise that the naming convention, you should start there. So if you're doing net new contracts or even bringing in legacy contracts, start with that, make sure it's agreed upon. And like anything, a good committee is probably in place as well. Because if you're McDonald's, GDPR is probably top of mind. You have mobile apps and websites. So why not have a GDPR committee that includes the discussion of contracts, where they should be, and then the various workflows that should be built out to support it.
Yeah, talking about committee, I often talk about that for project governance and all the players that need to be involved when you're talking about requirements gathering throughout the process. I talk about that a little bit in the book. And so I wondered what your point of view is on what stakeholders to have at the table during requirements. I think IT is important. Oftentimes we skip them and we just go straight to the business and legal. Who do you think your go-to people should be in your committee, either your steering committee or your stakeholder committee, for a CLM implementation, and then also for managing it ongoing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think during the discovery, I think it's situationally specific. So like if I gave that McDonald's example, my strong recommendation would be to have IT, because oftentimes they're supporting CLM, and then legal, because a lot of times I would say they're playing front and center with a lot of these type of discussions, and then marketing product, that would be who I would bring into that fray. I'm also curious after this, like, who would you bring into that? And then post implementation, or an ongoing basis, I would actually say virtually the same. I think the only people that I see during the implementation that may not stay, and you're familiar with this, is program managers on both sides. But I don't know, maybe there's a program manager or product owner that's announced or identified as, you're going to own CLM in perpetuity. So they would be also, I would recommend them to be included as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I like to have many teams involved up front, and then they sort of like fall to the wayside as we move through the project. But the IT and the security team is definitely important. Also because I find, and you may find this too, I'm curious about your point of view, is now that we're doing so much in-app contracting, the IT team really owns the apps that we want to connect with anyway.
Yep.
So I feel like it's important for them to have a seat at the table early.
Absolutely. And I would also say, go ahead. Yeah, I would also say a seat at the table early, but also as a business owner. Obviously their internal customers are going to be maybe the said teams, but I think oftentimes what I've observed, maybe historically a little more, is IT is not necessarily given a level of respect that we would give a legal team or a sales team or a marketing team, just to give those examples. But IT kind of holds the ship there if you give a ship analogy, they might be the people in the boiler room, and then all the other people are up on top on deck. But I think the boiler room folks are just as important, and oftentimes they're the ones that, have more knowledge. And like if we give the example of a marketing tech stack or, any other technology that's deployed, and there's a contractual element to it, wouldn't you want the people that are most tech savvy to understand, like, maybe it's actually collecting more data than we as laymen or laywomen actually think, and they can say, no, it's actually collecting here, there, and everywhere, and then that might I would say, impact or affect the contractual language.
Yeah, agree for sure. So I know that that this space is near and dear to your heart. I know there must be. I'm talking outside the podcast. We're going to go offline for a second. I want to make sure that we're covering many of the areas you wanted to cover. So guide me if there's some questions that I haven't asked you yet that you really want to spend some time talking about.
Okay. I would say, well, actually, there's another kind of the security assessments or privacy impact assessments. We can kind of incorporate that as well if you're good with it. And do you think the conversation is going good so far?
Yeah, it's fun. I'm having fun. It sounds like it's going well to me. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good. So I'm trying to think of how to segue into that discussion.
Okay, maybe...
where do you run into it?
Oh, go ahead. Well, actually, in reality, I'm just starting to, but maybe you could say, is there any other elements, maybe integrations when it comes to data privacy or security?
Okay, I think that makes sense. So I'll say that I'm going to just add another marker so I know where we stop talking about this, and then I'll dive into that. So Matthew, talking about integrations, that brings up a whole other layer of sort of data privacy. I wonder if you can talk about how that's impacted.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you and I fully know, like a sales use case implementation, you're often going to integrate with a CRM like Salesforce and Microsoft Dynamics. But I think talking about data privacy, again, they're beholden to, I would say the legal team especially is beholden to different laws and regulations. And so there is a concept of GRC, or governance, risk, and compliance. And so with that, there's actually a lot of great platforms on the market. One of the big leaders in the space is OneTrust. And so the idea there is potentially you could integrate via a API and maybe kick off the privacy impact assessment. Maybe it's the legal team, maybe it's the privacy team, depending on the size of the org. And they do that, and then they do that in advance of a workflow or any sort of contractual workflow. And so, or maybe the privacy impact assessment is finished, and then it kicks off a workflow based on, a specific rule or logic built into the contract workflow. Another thought too is a lot of CLMs, maybe if you're a smaller organization, could actually do either a privacy or a security impact assessment via web form that might also push into a template that can push into CLM. So again, maybe that's more small, medium, and you may not necessarily need a third party, robust platform. So those are my thoughts.
I was just thinking for customers that are smaller in nature and that may not have an organization or an area of the organization that does this kind of impact assessment for them, what does it typically involve, the privacy impact assessment?
Yeah, it's kind of, I liken it to, a lot of people are familiar with ISO, kind of do as you say as you do terminology. And so a privacy impact assessment too is, you send it out. Again, I think historically people have probably sent them out via Microsoft Word or email. And there's a specific set of questions like, what are you collecting in terms of data, from whom, why, how long you store it. These are a lot of it. And so I don't see why there's any reason for a small or medium that is using a CLM, and maybe they can integrate with a type form. That's just an example. Or a lot of the CLMs actually have web forms or e-forms that they also include in their product set. And so you could, again, you'd have to look at, is this, I guess I'm trying to gather my thoughts, is that allowable? But let's say it's allowable. There's no reason you couldn't just push these impact assessments out via one of those avenues and then collect the data. Again, it's people attesting that they are doing this, that, the other, and then that could potentially be pushed into either a template, and then from there, if you need any revisions, you can certainly do that, or it's just part of the workflow. You complete that, and then it kicks off the contractual portion.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. That's a good first step. I want to dig in a little bit further on integrations because I spent some time at Okta, and I know you've spent some time in the passwordless space. And it used to be, for those of you that don't know, and maybe you're still living in this world, that passwords were the way that most companies were hacked, right? As a employee using the same password over and over again. And we actually hear recently that the statistics are that more of the hacking is happening by intercepting the API endpoint. And so for those of you listening that aren't sort of familiar with that, it's the call and receipt that happens between the two applications. And we typically these days are connecting things through API because it's faster and it's real time. And that's the sort of the leading edge way of connecting all of these integrations for in-app contracting. So I'm wondering if you have a point of view around how we continue to protect those API endpoints as we're connecting them in CLM.
Yeah, that's a great call out, Cami, because I was just reading in the last week or so, how vulnerable they can be. I'd actually be curious to see the stat, in terms of the average, even enterprise organization, how many APIs they're using amongst their tech stack. Probably a staggering amount of number, and then those calls on a daily basis. In terms of bringing it back to kind of the CLM world or contractual world, I guess maybe the benefit of APIs, I think there's a lot of, different systems and technologies you can link into. From a CLM, you have CRM that I mentioned before, ERP, also a CPQ if you're sending out quotes. But I think if I'm understanding what you're asking, really think about it as a team. Is it worth the risk? Because the more APIs you have calling into a CLM, you're making yourself more vulnerable. And is that data really going to move the needle? For instance, if you're working with a sales team, it's a must that they work with CRM, but are all objects relevant? I've seen clients where maybe they over-engineer and they have too many objects that are pushing from CLM to Salesforce. So maybe you can do an audit or even pre-implementation to say, do we really need it on the quote level? Maybe it just needs to be on the opportunity level, for example, pushing in the contractual data.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think there's another consideration around like master data, especially if you're not using a CRM. Those things can be imported like on a one-off basis, right? And then depending on how often you need them to be updated, they can be updated through batch file or those kinds of mechanisms over time. And you don't need to have a real-time connection to open up that API for your customer master data. I talk to customers about that a lot. I'm just wondering if you also see, do you see a push towards integrate everything, or do you see customers being conscientious about these choices because of the potential for threats?
Actually, just going back to your point about the master data, I think that's a great call because I've had that recently, actually, in a discovery meeting where it was talked about, should we do an SSO or master data? And it depends on how often you're updating your employee, or who would access to CLM specifically. So I think your recommendation is sound. Actually, a lot of my clients probably aren't considering the API ramifications as we're talking about it. Something that I've definitely discussed before, and I know you have in your practice, but it's something that should be brought up by CLM practitioners at large. Does it really make sense? Or, there's another thing is you can push your CMM provider to work with their product team to make an actual integration, out-of-box integration. So as you know, out-of-box integration should decrease that liability. And I've seen some incredible ones where it just syncs. So that's ultimately where you want to go to, is maybe just the out-of-the-box integrations, if you can control that, and then really come together as a committee. Are these APIs, one, sometimes you can have bad data via APIs as well. So one, make sure that your CLM provider has great documentation on their APIs, and secondarily, can even support custom API integration. Some can, some cannot, but make sure the data that you're gleaning from those APIs is actionable, and the API calls are going to be stable and have good uptime.
Yeah, I think those are all really good call outs. Something I would add to that is, it used to be that we would advise customers, integrate as much as you can for your automated workflow, and I think that's great, and that's where we're going. But I do also think that there's a time to kind of sit back and audit exactly what you want to connect and why, and what you, just like you said, if it really moves the needle, or if you're just opening yourself up to more potential threat. So I think it's a definite discussion that we should be having, and I don't know if enough of us are having it because the excitement is to automate, right? The excitement is to not have to enter data into multiple systems. But I think we really have to be diligent about what data can be accessed how, right? So I always steer away from custom anything. I hear the word custom or bespoke, and I always want to run the other direction because for many reasons, my advice used to be, well, it takes a lot to maintain, and every time there's an upgrade, it can break. Those kinds of things are still relevant, I think. But when we're looking at developing custom ways for our applications to talk to each other, we just have to be really, really careful and cognizant about what that can truly mean, and if it's worth that risk. Yeah,
and I think that I like the C word configuration better, in terms of over customization, but. Kind of a side topic, and again, it's all interrelated in terms of moving forward integration. But what I really get excited about is, CLM in the future could be a lot more like CRM. You look at Salesforce, it's 20 plus years old now, and, they really have a cottage industry or these interrelated products in their platform. And so historically you was a CRM, and then you probably had to integrate outside and use APIs, but now there's so many things that you connect into Salesforce, that's your platform. And so that's what I'm excited that as you have more convergence, even in CLM, you also can control or limit that liability or security risk as well. Yeah, I think that's great. So those are all really great considerations for customers to be talking about, and practitioners too, when you're doing requirements or talking about expansion. What do you think, Matthew, are maybe like the top 3 takeaways that customers should consider when they're deploying a CLM around their practice of privacy and security? Do you have some top 3 things they should think about or keep top of mind? Yeah, I think in terms of data privacy security, I would say, as always, contracts rules. It's number 1. And so I would make sure, come together and make sure that the contracts that you're bringing into the fold, again, I go back to that marketing example with McDonald's, is this the right language? You also have the benefit of legacy contracts, so you can bring in and compare and contrast and make sure that you're making those amenable updates as privacy laws change. Given America alone, we're starting to have jurisdictional data privacy laws in different states like California, Colorado, Virginia, for an example, and I think there's pending legislation on a lot. So, contract's number 1 in making sure that the language is updatable, so it can be via clause library, and then it goes back to what we talked about, a committee. And I would say, secondly, another important thing is, maybe what we talked about is integrations. Maybe CLM can't do a holistic privacy impact assessment as part of the workflow at scale, but maybe you integrate. But that integration be key because they do what they do best. A GRC player that has a PIA, you integrate it, it either kicks off a workflow potentially, or it could just be part of a sub workflow into, say, that marketing contract with McDonald's. I would say another one too, and maybe we didn't talk about it, was making sure that every party knows the language. So for instance, if I'm, doing ad sales, maybe we'll just talk about a publisher. Maybe I'm at New York Times and everyone's vying for that ad space. Again, they use a lot of tech in the background. And so maybe there's a new marketing contract, a new player that they're working with, a third party. I'm the sales guy. I don't really understand privacy ramifications. And so we didn't talk about that a lot of CLMs have collaboration features. And so that's something where the legal team can educate that ad sales guy for New York Times on these are the specifics of the language. Or he can just raise his hand, trust amongst friends, and make sure that the language is understood. And also the salesperson in this scenario gets his input. It's not just a they versus them, but it's a collaborative effort to make sure that they can get that new advertiser on the New York Times real estate.
Yeah, that's great. Those are all great call outs. Matthew, where do you think the future is taking us this year for CLM in 2023?
Oh, wow. That's such a, the answer, well, one we all like to know. I think one thing, again, we can, actually, it's kind of along the lines of data privacy, I would say. So a lot of people are talking about GPT by OpenAI, and generative AI is something that I've been really keen on. I see a lot of people in CLM and just every other enterprise software platform seems to be looking at generative AI, whether it's ChatGPT or not. What my thoughts are is, will we see more of this? Everyone is cautious. Will this be the end of lawyers? And I don't think so. I think legal teams will, right. The great ones will still be there. And I think that something like ChatGPT, and you'll see a lot this, I think this will be more imbued within every CLM, is some sort of, again, this is just my thoughts, but some sort of chat AI. And then how can that do the low-level tasks? Obviously, when we're talking about contracts, there's a lot of review that comes into the fray. And if you're talking about, just say, a 30, 40-page contract, and there's all these red lines, it comes back bleeding, it's probably not in the best use of the legal team's time to look at more the tedious parts of the contract. And so something like ChatGPT or a lot of analytics products we have today, that can do all the mundane work. And so they can be the strategists and the business partners that they were set out to do. I think that, but then you have the question about, say, ChatGPT specifically, where are they getting that data from? That's something that I can't answer yet, but I'd have to imagine that that'll have to be vetted out. If you're utilizing these type of technologies, is that somebody else's proprietary contractual language? Is a data set from a, open source legal form? Was it from a paper that somebody drafted? So I think those are a lot of considerations. Right. And that's just incorporating of maybe future CLM and data privacy. I don't know. I mean, there's so many, what I would love to see is maybe a potential, CLM that they're having other products built on top of them. So I gave the Salesforce analogy, and I think one thing that they've really been successful at is AppExchange or Force.com. And so I would like to see, other CLMs have other systems built onto them, not just integrated, but built on top. And they're building out their own version of legal ops or, subsets of CLM. And then that also is probably a more privacy, security-centric way of going about your business too, as legal ops continues to evolve.
Yeah, I love that. That's sort of my vision too. You and I have had this conversation a lot where I say I feel like CLM should be middleware, and all my CLM salespeople want to give groan. But I think that it is when you can sort of bolt on the other important pieces for contracting and doing business to your CLM tool, like the sky's the limit in what you can be empowered to do. So I'm excited to kind of watch this CLM next. I call it CLM 3.0, right? The next wave of the journey happening, and a lot of it's going to be tempered by what the findings are around ChatGPT, I think.
Yeah, and then one last consideration, you mentioned CLM 3.0. They're always talking about Web 3.0. It's kind of a buzzword. And the last thing I would be curious about is we talk about smart contracts, but those are more like the tokenization of things. But could there actually be, immutable smart contracts that are in CLMs? I know a lot of CLM players have kind of dabbled in that space, but could it be native and organic within it? That might be interesting too, where it's a, immutable contract, and that, especially from maybe a kind of a supply side standpoint, you have a car, just giving the car example, there's 30,000 different parts for most cars, I think on average, somewhere around there. And so from a global supply chain and who you're getting them from, that might be interesting. But again, I haven't seen any CLM really incorporate it natively, but maybe they're partnering with some kind of blockchain or NFT, a dynamic NFT. So that, again, I'd like to see that, but maybe that's many years down the road for a CLM 3.0.
Yeah, CLM 3.0 it's going to be here before we know it.
Yeah,
Matthew,
it'll be exciting. And go ahead.
Yeah, it will be really exciting. So I'm going to grab my popcorn and I'm here to watch it. Anyway, I just wanted to thank you so much for joining me today. This has been really fun. You're somebody that I love speaking to just about this space in general because you have such a great background. And, we've known each other for a long time. So I'm always interested in your perspective. So thanks so much for coming on and sharing it today.
Yeah, it was good to talk to the doctor.
I do not have a medical license to practice medicine, just so everyone knows.
Okay.
Anyway. Okay. Yeah. I'll cut that part out, but anyway, it was funny. So thank you so much, Matthew. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop recording.
Okay.
I was gonna stop here in just a second, but let's sort of do our closing goodbye since I was laughing and we were talking over each other. So I'll say thank you for joining, and then you can wrap up if you want. Will that work?
Okay. Yep. Sounds good.
Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you so much, Matthew, for joining me today. We had so much fun chatting about the future of CLM and especially around security and data privacy. So thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the discussion. I'd like to see where it goes, and I can't wait to see who else you have on the podcast too. And also, I'm always learning about CLM and its evolution, and can't wait for those upcoming episodes too.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matthew. I appreciate it. We'll talk soon. Stay in
Absolutely.
touch.
Thank you. Bye.